we are experiencing intermittent internet issues. We are aware of it. They're working on it district-wide. We will send an email when it is fixed.
So we're having intermittent internet issues, which means we'll see how this goes. That's what it means. If something happens, then we'll have a plan. So, okay, so I totally lost. Oh, we're recording. Now we're here. Okay. So our plan today is talk a few more through some scenarios, and then we're going to talk about voting eligibility in America. And you are going to have an assignment that you're going to work on yourself, which is due Friday, which is going to be giving you a number of different scenarios and applying those scenarios in terms of responding violation, no violation, and then which amendment would be used in that circumstance. Okay. So let's go over a couple more scenarios before we get started on the second part of what we're doing based on what we discussed yesterday. So yesterday we went through the analysis of the Bill of Rights. We went through and discussed what each represents, and then we applied those ideas to different scenarios, just hypothetical scenarios. So we're going to do a couple more here, okay? All right, so you are at home and there is a knock at the door. A police officer says that they suspect that your brother stole items from a local store. They ask you to enter the home and you respond by saying that you are certain that your brother has done nothing wrong. Before you realize it, the police officer has pushed his way past you and begins looking through your home for evidence that your brother is guilty. So the question I would ask in this circumstance is there a violation in place or no violation? And then which amendment would be used in this scenario? Maya, what do you got?
This is a violation of the Fourth Amendment, which protects you from unwarranted search and seizure. The officer did not have a warrant, therefore he is not able to enter your home and look through it because, yeah, that's all I got.
No, that's exactly right. Thank you. It doesn't mention anything about a warrant. It also doesn't mention anything in the description that the police officer has probable cause to enter. Okay, so let's add on to this a little bit, and let's say hypothetically that there was evidence found that actually proves that your brother committed the crime. If any evidence is found under the circumstance in this scenario, it would be ruled what's called inadmissible, which means if they found any evidence, they could not use it against you for that crime because it was gathered illegally. No warrant, no probable cause. Okay. Alex, do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, well, I think in this situation it's kind of lack of context because, like you said, it doesn't mention a warrant, so we really don't know if he has a warrant. But if he doesn't, then, like you said, then no evidence can be found.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you make a good point that, you know, we have to go by what it says here, and obviously we could add in things and to the scenario that would change the outcome. But in this circumstance, if we base it on what is being presented to us, it's going to be very much specific to obviously violating Fourth Amendment. Okay. All right, let's do another one. I had these kind of mixed up in different orders. So scenario 6, you are arrested for suspicion of theft. The police officer takes you into an interview room. After a few minutes, they return with a document that they say is a confession statement. You are not allowed to speak to a lawyer or leave, and they force you to sign the confession saying that you committed the crime. So would we see violation, no violation, and then what amendment would we be looking at here in this circumstance? Give you a second to think on it and look at your notes or your document. Okay, Eileen, what do you got?
It's a violation of Article 5.
Okay, what specific part of the Fifth Amendment?
That no person shall be held, no one's supposed to be held to answer for a crime unless they are convicted by a jury.
Okay, that is true. The one thing that I would say is that we don't really have a clear indication that this does go to trial. But there is an aspect of the Fifth Amendment that would involve this scenario. But I will tell you, folks, that there are actually two different amendments that you could use in this situation. Adela, what do you think?
Wouldn't it be Amendment 5 where it says, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself?
Yep. So in this circumstance, we have a situation where they're trying to get the person accused of the crime to admit the guilt and therefore, incriminate themselves. Okay. If they're going to force you to sign a confession, they're violating your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Okay. But there's another amendment that could also apply here. Joyce, what do you think?
6, because you have the right to a lawyer.
Yep. Being denied the right to a lawyer violates your Sixth Amendment right. And so in this circumstance, if we took it a little bit further and stretched it along, if you did have this situation where you're forced to sign a confession and you were denied the right to a lawyer, it could in that circumstance be a situation where both of these amendments are violated. And if you did end up getting a lawyer, they could show that, and the charges against you would probably be dropped in that circumstance. Okay. We're going to have more situations and more circumstances and scenarios like this with the assignment. They're not quite as drawn out, but it'll be the same approach where you're going to have to choose whether or not there's a violation that has occurred and then what amendment that applies to it. Okay. Okay, we're going to switch gears because part of the thing I told you this week is we were going to talk about elections and voting. Maya and Adela, I saw questions about or comments, or were those just from before?
Mine was just from before.
Okay. Maya, do you have a question? Oh, you good? Okay. Okay, so if you go back to the course page, the second thing listed in the course page says voting eligibility in American history. Voter eligibility. If you could pull that up, please. It's a PDF. So back on the home page for today, period 5, Wednesday the 28th. The second thing listed says voter eligibility, and there's an embedded link. And I'd like you to put that. You don't have to put it in the notability necessarily, but I want to be able to discuss this with you. So in order to kind of understand more about this election process, which I know many of us already have a good amount of understanding how that works, we need to look at the evolution of voting eligibility in this country, because it's not as if we got to the point where we got to the current situation where everybody became eligible instantly, and it's not been a perfect system by any means. Okay, and I think we all understand that. But with that said, it's important to look at the circumstance of what was originally in place versus what we have today. Okay, and so we kind of start off, first of all, looking at if I'm a voter in the very first presidential election. Hold on, my computer's slowing up here. I'm trying to get the document open here. Bear with me just a second. All right. Okay. If I'm a voter in this first election, there's a couple things that, first of all, you need to understand that this election was unlike any election really since then, because the first election in which Washington's elected president, and by the way, unanimously, and that's because of his status as a hero in the eyes of America, largely, This actually took place over the course of the end of 1788 into 1789. Okay, so a lot of times when you look up this election, it says 1788-1789 because the election started in the fall of 1788 and carried through into the winter of 1789 because we didn't have a designated voting day as the first Tuesday in November. And that's actually going to be the case for a while because that is not implemented until much later. And also, unlike today, where we can get results pretty quickly, obviously it's going to take some time to count all the votes up, to get all the locations and ballots counted up for a state and for a community, and then having to do that for all 13 states. It takes a while. Okay. Now, I will tell you that a couple of the states did not vote in the first presidential election because they had not ratified the Constitution. And when we get into the more historical topics and we talk about that first election, I'll be able to give you that visual of what that electoral map looks like. And we actually might get to that tomorrow and Friday when we start talking about the Electoral College. But individual states set voter eligibility. So in some very small circumstances in history, we have situations where states gave women the right to vote for a very short amount of time and also gave free African Americans the right to vote for a very short time. But this was not a blanket policy, meaning it applied everywhere. Okay, so early on, if you were going to be a voter, you were a white male, 21 years old, citizen, and you were a landowner or could prove that you had paid a significant amount of money in taxes. Okay, now what's crazy to think about is that if you look at these expectations or requirements, you're only looking at, in terms of voters in that first election, 6% of the population that voted. 6%. Okay? So if you based it on the criteria of the population, and especially this last one when it comes to land ownership, it's only 6%. And to a lot of people, that's really surprising. But if you look at historical trends with voting in the United States, we only average somewhere in the mid 50s in terms of percent. So let's say on average, it's only around 55 to 57% of those who are eligible to vote that actually do vote. And we're going to talk about that more in a little bit. Okay. So in 1790, we had what was called the Naturalization Act, which allowed for a clear pathway for non-natural born citizens to gain citizenship and voting rights under what was referred to as white men of good character. And the good character in quotation is actually from the exact law. And that's the language that they used for it. Okay. Now, voting citizenship pathways in terms of years has varied over time. At one time, it was 5 years originally, then it was up to 14 years, and currently it is 7 years. Okay. But obviously, you have to be a citizen to be able to vote. Now, it is important to note that some states in the North did grant voting rights in certain communities for free African Americans, but this was very short-lived. Okay, this was not, again, a policy where every free African American was given the right to vote in every northern state. Okay, and obviously you would see this much more in northern states than southern states because by this point in the early 1820s, most northern states have ended slavery, while the southern states have continued the policy of having slavery because it's very important to their economy. Okay. And so if we go back and we look at the original expectations here, the first one of these that's going to be eliminated in terms of a requirement is this one. Because what happens is there's more enfranchisement or more voting rights for people eligible during this era of 1800 to 1836. And here's the reason why. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson gets elected, and you begin the start of what's called the Jeffersonian era. And that also includes not only his 2 terms, but it kind of falls under the same model with the presidencies that followed of James Madison and James Monroe, okay, because they were all Democratic Republicans, which that was one of the original 2 parties. When Andrew Jackson becomes president, you have more states that drop the requirement of owning land and allow more middle and lower class white men, 21 years of age or older, to vote. And at that time, those individuals were going to identify much more with Andrew Jackson than they would someone who had more of this elitist status in society. And so this, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of more voters that are eligible. And we really start to see this in the election of 1828, which was the first election in which Andrew Jackson is elected president. Okay. Now, ironically, you still had two states into the early 20th century that still had voting eligibility be based on land ownership or taxes being paid. Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, two of those examples. But it's amazing to think that they originally tied your wealth to a certain extent with voting. And honestly, a lot of Federalists wanted more in tune, wanted voters to be those that were more in tune with society, more in tune with how government works, and knew the candidates more. And it wouldn't just be about, Joe Schmo from rural North Carolina only knows the candidate from his home state and doesn't know other candidates, okay? Now, obviously, the big change happens right here, 15th Amendment, okay? So you have the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the 14th Amendment, which preserved citizenship regardless of race, and then the 15th Amendment was intended to be the amendment that would once and for all provide a federal policy to protect voting rights for people regardless of, as it says, race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And obviously, when we're talking about here, we're talking about those who were enslaved, okay? But here's the problem. Reconstruction, which is the period after the Civil War, in which the federal government was heavily involved in the rebuilding of the state, including the process of protecting the rights of African Americans, like the Freedmen's Bureau, for example. That's all going to end in 1876 because of probably the most consequential election that we've ever had. So in 1876, we had Samuel Tilden going up against Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, to show you how big of a deal this was, the election of 1876 had the highest voter turnout in American history, 81.8%. Sorry, I don't have my stylus pen with me today. So 81.8% of eligible voters voted in that election. We haven't even, 1860 when Lincoln won and this election are the only times we've ever been over 80% in terms of voter turnout. It's unbelievable. But this was the election that ultimately resulted in the end of Reconstruction, because here's what happened. The election was so close, 3 states' electoral results were disputed. It ended up going to the House of Representatives, and essentially a bargain was made in 1876 in what became the Compromise of 1877. Rutherford B. Hayes was declared the winner, and federal control of Reconstruction in the South ended, which means the federal government is no longer enforcing policies in the South to protect African Americans. So what happens as a result? Discrimination increases, and states find ways to prevent African Americans from voting. And these are the 3 most famous examples, many of which I know you've heard of before: literacy tests, poll taxes, and voter intimidation. Can somebody tell me what a literacy test is and how it relates to an election? Cassidy?
It was basically a test to see if you were quote unquote smart enough to vote, but it was extremely rigged.
Yeah, that's a great way. Yeah, it's a great way of putting it.
To make it almost impossible to score.
Yep. So to put it to make it even more amazing in terms of what this was, one of the most famous examples is one that came from Louisiana. And several years ago, they gave a bunch of Harvard University students a version of the test to take, which required them to answer 30 questions in 10 minutes and not get any questions wrong. And none of the students got them all right. So this was a test designed specifically, and it was supposed to be given to anyone who cannot prove a 5th grade education. But the majority of the time, this test was specifically targeted to African Americans. It's impossible to answer all the questions on the test or get them all right, because these are questions that have they have nothing to do with elections. It's not about a civics test or understanding. It's like, how many bubbles are there on a bar of soap? I'm not kidding you. Okay. When I give you a sample one for you to look at, you'll be astonished at some of the questions they're asking you, because it's questions that are designed for you to feel as if you're unintelligent, because the questions are absurd. And if someone goes into this situation taking a literacy test and they realize that their voting livelihood depends on their success on this test, it puts all this added pressure on them to the point where they can't be successful. And the point is that Southern states were trying to deny African Americans the right to vote, not necessarily in their minds violating the 15th Amendment, but providing additional hurdle that they had to cross to get to where they could be able to vote. Ailuan? Do you have a question?
Actually, we took it, yeah, in Mr. Basinger's class last year, we actually took the test.
There you go.
They gave us.
Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. You know the absurdity with it and how it would have been, the majority, I mean, think about it. Those who were perfectly eligible to vote couldn't have passed it either. And yet this was another hurdle. And then the poll taxes, which require you to pay a tax to the state government to be eligible to vote. What if you're a lower class citizen and you don't have that money? And then finally, voter intimidation. When Reconstruction ended, that's when the rise of the Ku Klux Klan started. And the Ku Klux Klan was a group that targeted specific voters, especially African Americans, and intimidated them using violence to keep them from going to the polls to vote. Okay? And it's amazing to think that we have this amendment that should be the end-all question of denying people based on race the right to vote, and yet we still have this circumstance. Okay? One of the groups that a lot of people don't realize were affected as much voting or lack thereof ability of voting were Native Americans. And in 1887, a federal law was created that said, if you wish to become a citizen and then have the right to vote, you can do that as a Native American if you disassociate yourself from your tribe. So if you are an active member of the Apache Nation, if you take a pledge to disassociate yourself from your tribe, you could become a citizen of the United States. And it was at a time, again, after the Civil War, where we saw a lot of contentious relationships between the federal government and Native American tribes, especially out west, as federal land began to be acquired one after another by the federal government. Okay. And then the 17th Amendment, this is one that honestly a lot of people don't know about. It's one of those amendments that's kind of forgotten. But there was a time where if you were a voter, you didn't get to vote for your senators. The state government voted for the senators or chose the senators. So in 1913, just over 100 years ago, was the first time that actually voters would directly vote for the members of the U.S. Senate like they would the members of the House of Representatives from their state. Because the argument was, if these two senators are supposed to be representing us and speaking for us, why don't we have an involvement in choosing who they are, like we would members of the House of Representatives, okay? 19th Amendment, we're celebrating the 100th year this year. It's hard to believe it's only been 100 years. But this by no means, as many of you I'm aware, the beginning, which is called women's suffrage, SUFFRAGE. That dates all the way back to the 1840s. So it took almost 80 years for women to be given the right to vote. I will say, though, that there were several states prior to 1920 that had already implemented voting rights in their state for women, but this was the policy that would apply to all the states, okay? 1924, Native Americans are granted citizenship and right to vote. They don't have to have this disassociation pledge as it did in 1887, okay? This one to me is the one that I just still am shocked by the most because of the date in terms of its not being that far back. So as recent as 1961, just before that, if you lived in Washington, D.C., the Federal District of Columbia, you were ineligible to vote in the presidential election. Think about that. Washington, D.C. as a city is more or less founded right around 1800. And for over 150 years, if you lived in Washington, D.C., you didn't get to vote for the President of the United States. It took a federal amendment to give voting rights to citizens in elections and to give Washington, D.C. electoral votes in the Electoral College, in which they would actually have an input on the way that we officially elect the president, which is through the Electoral College. And they were given 3, which is the equivalent of the lowest number that any state would have. So like Wyoming, Alaska, North and South Dakota, for example, they only have 3, which represents the total number of senators they have and the lone representative that they have, okay? 24th Amendment, poll tax is prohibited, so no longer having to pay a tax to require voting. And it's important to note the date here. We know that the early to mid 60s is the heightened period of the civil rights movement, and so many important pieces of legislation were created in the early 1960s, the Civil Rights Act. And then in 1965, we had the groundbreaking Voting Rights Act, which basically says you cannot discriminate against people based on race in any regard with literacy tests or poll taxes to deny them the constitutional right to vote that they should have, already have. Now, it's amazing to look at the fact that we're almost 100 years after the 15th Amendment, that they had to basically create a supplemental law that would protect a right that should have been in place from the very beginning, okay? And then finally, we leave off with the most recent major decision involving the voting age, which is the 26th Amendment in 1971, which lowered the voting age to vote in the presidential elections from 21 to 18, because obviously this coincided with Vietnam. 18-year-olds being drafted into the military service are not able to vote. And so that would change that directly, okay? Are there any quick questions before we stop for today? One of the things that we're going to be doing tomorrow is we are going to be talking about the Electoral College and the electoral voting process, and talking about the difference between swing states and safe states, which I know a lot of you are already aware of. Please note for today that there is an exit ticket that I need you to complete that's asking you to discuss two arguments or 2 facts about what you learn about voter eligibility, which you can find in the course page. And don't forget the Bill of Rights assignment on the scenarios, which is number 3 on today's course page, which is due on Friday, and I will be checking in with you tomorrow on that as well. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and conclude the meeting now, and I will see you tomorrow at 12 o'clock. If you have any general questions about elections, please bring those tomorrow to class, okay? Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.